Hey friends, welcome back to Thriving Line Healing Podcast. And this week is episode 87, and we are talking about adrenal fatigue and all the fun stuff. This is part of Dr. Carmen and my New Beginning program because we test people's neurotransmitters, their hormones, and their adrenals. And so it's so interesting. I'm in a very large Facebook group. And one lady posted about adrenal fatigue. And it was so interesting to listen or read people's comments because half of the people were like, adrenal fatigue is not a thing. Adrenal fatigue, it doesn't have a diagnosis. Conventional medicine doesn't even recognize this. One lady said that organs can't be fatigued. Right. And then you have the other group of people that are like, yeah, this is a real thing. Like, here's, supplements or here's things to address it. And it's so interesting to see how like divided people get and like very staunch about it. Like they really think that their answer is the absolute correct right answer. I'm not going to take the time to dive into their backgrounds and see like, are you a medical professional or are you just a lay person with lots of opinions. So I thought it would be really interesting to talk about this and our experience with it and your experience as a physician that's been to conventional med school and to naturopathic med school. So let's dive in.
All right. So a couple of points. As far as conventional medicine goes and their understanding of the adrenals, right? It's very limited, to be honest. The adrenals are those glands that sit on top of your kidneys, right? And they are divided into different parts. And so as far as conventional medicine goes, dysfunction of adrenals are usually categorized on two ends of the spectrum, either Addison's, which is an autoimmune condition that's attacking your adrenals so that you can't make adrenal or cortisol, the adrenal hormone, or Cushing's, where you're making too much. And usually those associated with tumors on the Cushing side. And so as far as conventional medicine goes, when they go to test for adrenal function or dysfunction, they only look at blood. They look at serum labs. And the serum labs don't give us enough information. Okay. So this is where it can get a little bit tricky because people will ask because they've heard of adrenal fatigue and, different cortisol syndrome. So they'll ask their conventional doc, hey, will you test my cortisol? And then they'll test their cortisol and it comes back normal. The range isn't huge, but it'll come back normal. And they'll say, oh, you don't have a cortisol problem, because they're only looking through the lens of a autoimmune, right? Where you're on the low, it's not even the low end of the range. You're just not producing enough cortisol, or you're above the range and you're producing too much cortisol, right? And there's no in between as far as their understanding, right, of that scenario. Now, this also is challenging because the adrenals, not only do they produce cortisol, but they also help to balance out our electrolytes, our sodium, our potassium, and our other electrolytes. So they're also very essential in balancing out our water and controlling dehydration and that component and that piece of it. And so unless there's a tumor or cancer associated with the adrenals, it's really not on the radar of conventional medicine. Okay. Now, that being said, stress is on the radar of conventional medicine.
Yeah.
Okay. The stress response, long-term chronic stress, it wasn't on the radar of conventional medicine, even maybe about 7-8 years ago, but it's becoming more and more relevant, especially within the last 2 years. They're putting out studies now trying to educate primary care physicians and other even specialties to recognize the stress response and to recognize, how that's affecting our physical health.
Mm-hmm.
Now, unfortunately, they don't have a lot of options. A lot of their options are in the anti-anxiety realm, anti-depressant realm, to address the stress response. And that's about all they have right now to offer, and therapy to address those things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that targets the conventional understanding of the adrenals. Okay. And I mean, it is changing. If you go to a functional medicine doc or an integrative medicine doctor, there's a much better understanding of adrenal fatigue and adrenal dysfunction, because it's a spectrum, right? Just like that change in our stress response, if it's something acute, right, it may only last 20 minutes, half an hour, an hour, and then we can kind of reset. But when it becomes weeks, months, years, and since more and more of the population, especially in the US, are experiencing that chronic stress, sort of that population of symptoms is also growing and growing to the point where conventional medicine has to address it. So that's sort of where the discrepancy lies.
Okay.
Now, the type of testing that we do in New Beginnings and with naturopathic care is we're looking at the adrenal function in a saliva test, okay? Because we know that when our body produces cortisol, naturally, it's actually in a cyclic pattern that usually our body produces the most cortisol in the morning. I tell folks when we're overnight, right, and you're resting well, and you get a restful regenerative sleep, it refills that cortisol levels. And so they're the highest of the morning, help us get motivated, get out of bed, get dressed, get going, start our day. And then it naturally begins to decrease till about mid-morning, noon-ish. Then it's still continues to decrease, but the slope is a lot more gradual, and then it should be lowest at bedtime to help us get that restful sleep. And so when we're checking for adrenal function with saliva labs, we're doing it 4 times a day. So the timing is very important to get an accurate understanding of where your adrenals are. Like, do you have enough energy throughout the day? Are you hitting that slump at between 1 and 3 p.m.? Do you need to take a nap or reach for another cup of coffee, or, grab some sweet treats or something? Are you having trouble falling asleep because you can't take your mind off at night? You can't turn your mind off at night, right? Like maybe you're getting a little bit of a second wind and your body's not able to metabolize the cortisol to help you fall asleep at night. And so when we map it over over a day, we get a much more accurate understanding of how our adrenals are functioning, how they're responding to things. And that gives us evidence of where we're at in handling our chronic stress.
So I have a question. So the blood only tests 1 point in the day, right, of your cortisol. So, yeah. And so I get that. And the saliva that we do is 4 times. But in and of themselves, what data does the saliva test give us differently than the blood test?
So the saliva is looking at the metabolites of the cortisol.
What does that mean?
So that's how our body uses cortisol and breaks it down, right?
Okay.
So when we get that cortisol spike, that happens in our adrenals as a response from our brain, right? From the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland in our brain, stimulates that. Well, when that cortisol is released into our bloodstream, our body uses it for different reactions, for like a change in the blood flow, right? And for that epinephrine and norepinephrine and epinephrine surge. And then our body has to degrade it. And so it metabolizes it or begins to break it down. And that's what we are actually measuring in the saliva.
Okay.
Yeah, are the metabolites.
Don't measure the metabolism of it.
No. And the blood test, so when I talk about the range, right, that range is from the highest amount that we expect of a morning to the lowest amount, we have it in the evening. So it's a little bit of a broader range, right? Versus when you're testing the saliva throughout the 4 points of the day, each time has a specific range, right? So in the morning, we expect it to be higher. So that should be a higher range versus midday, mid-afternoon and evening, it should be the lowest, and that's the shortest range. So we expect it to fall within that range so that we can see where within the natural cortisol curve somebody is, responding.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense? Yes. All right. So, okay, let's see. There was another point that you wanted to bring up. Oh, and to speak to whether our organs become fatigued, right? So we often don't always put our organs to the test to the point they become fatigued, right?
Okay.
And so we may not always recognize that, but just as when you're working out, your muscles get fatigued and need time to recover, right? We know in other chronic illnesses like diabetes, when people go from non-insulin dependent diabetics and they don't make changes and they get to a point where they become insulin dependent diabetics, it's because their pancreas is fatigued. Yeah, their pancreas cannot produce the insulin that they need to anymore. And sometimes that can be because of years of a bad diet. Sometimes that can be because of years of medication. There are some diabetic medications that stimulate the pancreas to make more insulin, makes more insulin, and it has a time limit. That may only be good for about 10, 12 years. And then it maxes out and the pancreas is like, it just gets fatigued and it can't do it anymore. Yeah. So we do see that with other organs, right? Endocrine or the pancreas is an endocrine organ, just like the adrenals are. So it really becomes down to sort of that demand, right? If we're demanding those glands to produce more and more hormones, whether cortisol, insulin, then it becomes a point where it's like, it was not biologically designed to produce continuous amounts. It was designed to have a reset, right? To have a break, you have a lull in that cycle so that you can regenerate. And so that chronic demand really takes a toll on our body, right? Yeah. When we're talking about adrenal fatigue, so usually adrenal fatigue is a result of chronic stress, right? And sometimes I feel like I have to clarify because it's a matter of chronic stress, but it's a matter of folks not handling their stress well or coping with that stress well, right? We are always going to have stress in our life. That's what it's like to be human, right? We're always going to have stress in some form or fashion. It's a matter of how we acknowledge that stress and how we let that stress affect us is what directly relates to the demand of cortisol.
Yeah. And I want to clarify on that too, from my perspective as a coach. So there are people let's say there is a long line at Walmart and we're all trying to check out and get our holiday presents.
Yeah.
If you take that line of 20 people, let's just say, and I'm making up numbers, 10 of those 20 people do not see that line as a problem. Okay. They're just like, hey, I'm in line. I've got my present. I will eventually get to the front. I will give them my money. I will get to take this present, right? The other 10, it's a problem. They're irritated they're in line. They're frustrated that they have to be in line. The line isn't moving fast enough, right? The humans aren't behaving like they should be, right? Those 10 people are in a stress response, right? Like they're stressed. And the other 10 don't see that as a stressful place. So this is like what you're talking about. Yes, there is stress, but some of us do not manage life well enough that we see every event as stressful. And so we're constantly experiencing stress because everything we're taking in, work, kids, life, it's all stressful, financial, and we just keep piling on to this stress, right? And we just feel stressed all the time. And there are other humans that don't feel that, right? So it's a matter of perception. Life is always going to offer us up things. It's how we perceive it and make a decision whether we're going to be stressed about it and worry about it, or this isn't a problem. And that's why we see chronic stress, is because of our perception. And some people just choose to not see that line as a problem.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it helps to clarify that, especially when we're talking about adrenal dysfunction or dysregulation, adrenal fatigue, because in that sense, adrenal fatigue can look different per person as well. Yeah. Some of the symptoms like that you'll see when people have quizzes about adrenal fatigue, or they're promoting adrenal dysregulation program, are things like the lack of energy. That gets most of us. If we don't have the energy to get up, get going, to do the things the tasks that we need to throughout the day, if we feel like we're dragging all the time, that's usually one of the key things that we're always targeting when we're addressing adrenals. Because our adrenals are supposed to help with that natural energy, right? Instead of having to reach for energy drinks or coffee or caffeine in whatever form or fashion. Definitely, emotional stress. Let's see, people have trouble focusing or trouble sleeping. If you have early morning fatigue, even though you slept well, those all can be signs of adrenal dysfunction. And because it is a spectrum, right? On our testing, it will identify if people are in adrenal dysfunction, a phase 1, 2, or 3. And so the less energy you have, often the more sort of susceptible you are to stress. Usually that translates into an adrenal dysfunction phase 3. Those folks may feel like they're running on empty, right? They may feel like they just don't have the energy. They're getting things done because they're pushing through, because that's what they've been taught. That's what they have to do. They've got family, kids, work, etc. And so they just push through to get things done, not really having that, like natural energy, if you will. Now, because of the physiological changes with chronic stress and that adrenal fatigue, oftentimes it translates into other more systemic symptoms, right? Things like hair loss, things like acne, psoriasis, things like insomnia, or difficulty sleeping, headaches or migraines, digestion dysfunction can also be a result, because when we're underneath that chronic stress, those physiological effects of the increased cortisol actually changes the blood flow to our extremities, to our hands, our feet, our I can't say they're non-essential organs, but because we kind of need all of them, but it shunts the blood to our heart and lungs, because our body's in survival mode, right? Our body and our brain are in survival mode, thinking, okay, we're under stress. We need to be prepared to run away from that lion, or back in the day, go out and catch dinner, right? And so if we're in survival mode, then you don't need to worry about digestion, right? So chronic stress can result in digestive dysfunction, and sort of, everything that can entail, and lead to like intestinal permeability type pictures, or leaky gut type pictures, because that increased blood to the heart and lungs, because we're in survival mode, can increase our blood pressure, increase our risk for heart disease and heart attacks, right? Increase like asthma, make asthma symptoms worse, or a shorter trigger for asthma. And because we're sort of that long term, that high demand for cortisol can affect our sex hormones, right? It can directly affect our estrogen, our progesterone, our testosterone. People may have a lower libido. They may have periods that are either come too often or don't come often enough as a result. And so I think that when we're looking at adrenal fatigue, sometimes it's hard for conventional medicine to pin down that it's more of a clinical diagnosis, if you will, because the cortisol spans across all organ systems.
Yeah.
And conventional medicine is very set up to be a specialty, right? If you have a specific problem, you may go to a primary, right? Or internal med doc, and then you go to a specialist, you go to a gastroenterologist, even an endocrinologist or a rheumatologist. But those endocrinologists are only looking for those two ends of the spectrum, that Addison's or Cushing's. And so, but because cortisol is so integral in so many, our entire body, all our organ systems and our entire physiology, it's a little bit, I guess, harder to diagnose, I guess, within conventional medicine. So they're just not there yet.
Yeah.
But when we're looking from a whole person, a holistic perspective, and you can start to kind of put those dots together and see, how the adrenals affect our other organ systems, how they affect our other hormones, our thyroid hormone, even our thyroid as well, and our ability to produce thyroid hormone, then you can start to see, well, okay, if the adrenals are part of the root cause and we address the adrenal dysfunction, then oftentimes the other organ systems will be able to come back into balance, because either they're getting their blood flow or they're getting the nutrients they need in order to do their jobs.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And it's like, even though the medical community doesn't have a diagnosis yet, of adrenal fatigue or dysfunction, doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? Like, they did not have diagnosis for lots of things, and now they do. It just took a while to catch up, because that's not how that system is set up.
Yeah. My best example is leaky gut, right? Intestinal permeability is now what it's called in the conventional medicine world, but leaky gut for the longest time was not diagnosed and was not diagnosable. So people who had digestive issues, who either had chronic diarrhea, chronic constipation, chronic heartburn, or like abdominal pain, and they were young people that are getting, like, in their 20s and 30s, that are getting colonoscopies and endoscopies, and they're coming back and they're like, there's nothing wrong with you. We don't know why you have chronic constipation or why you're having to go to the bathroom every time you eat, where it's like within 10 minutes, you've got to find a toilet after you eat a meal. And so they just didn't have answers. They just said, well, it's in your head, or there isn't something physiologically wrong within the digestive tract. And it turns out it's because their understanding of the digestive tract was not there yet, right? And that leaky gut is more on a microscopic level and not on a macroscopic level, which is what they were looking at with colonoscopies and EGDs. And so it's just that, their knowledge is growing, right? Just like hopefully the rest of us, as we understand more about the world around us, right? Our knowledge grows. So it's the same thing that happens within medicine. The field of medicine is that we're still learning about things within our body. I mean, the whole the science community, the medical sciences, if you will, are still gathering more data and more information, right? And so our understanding of organ systems or even diagnoses are still changing. It's just a slow process. It's just a slow process.
And I think some important, because I think as lay people, we're educated that cortisol is kind of a bad thing because it's associated with stress, right? And when we started on this adventure together, and I started learning more about it, and then we started implementing it in our program, like I learned that cortisol is actually a really good thing, because it is what like wakes us up and gives us energy, right? Like it's what is everything in moderation, right? It's when it's in high demand and in excess is when it becomes a negative thing, just like when too much sugar, eating the whole cake is not a good thing, right? But cortisol is not our enemy. Like we need proper amounts of cortisol. That's what gives us energy and like helps us get going, right?
Right.
It's
Yes.
not just this negative thing that's tied with stress.
Right. We two things. One, this is also similar with inflammation. A lot of people think inflammation is bad, right? Yeah. It's necessary. We need our inflammation means your immune system is working. But as far as cortisol goes, yeah, we need that cortisol, right? Like we need to be able to recognize a threat if we need to be in survival mode. Right. But you're right, it's in moderation, and our body naturally has the mechanisms to fluctuate and have a cortisol rhythm or a cortisol cycle every day. And so it's honoring that and being able to balance out our perception of stress so that our demand doesn't knock that cortisol curve out of the park.
Yeah. And we have a podcast episode. It's how to become resilient towards stress. I can't remember. It's probably in the 60s. Yeah. So if you're struggling with this idea of being resilient to stress, that episode would be really good, because that's what we teach in New Beginnings. We test, then Dr. Carmen goes to work with like, here's how we need to adjust your diet. Here's some supplements, possibly, depending where you're at, right? To get the body to start healing and giving it the nutrients it needs, right? And we'll talk about it in just a minute, to start producing things in adequate amounts. But we also dive into all the mindset stuff, so you can become resistant to stress, right? And you can have, like change your perspective and be able to see the world and choose whether I want to respond with stress or not, and not just constantly fall victim into the stress mindset. Because it is, we have not been taught how to handle our emotions. We've not been taught how to perceive things and just make decisions on how we're going to respond and feel about it. We've just been taught to be reactive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So when that's when we're reactive, right? That's nice to have that response, but understanding that you have control over that cortisol response to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The other thing to take into consideration is that when our cortisol is high, and when that demand is high, that our body uses more nutrients, right? It has to keep up with that demand. And that's where we can start to see like nutrient deficiencies, right? Things like a magnesium deficiency or vitamin C deficiency are important to note, because our body or our adrenals use those nutrients as cofactors to produce that cortisol that you're demanding of your body. So it's going to deplete those reserves very quickly. Right. Yeah. So you guys may have seen or heard a lot of advertisements that talk about magnesium. Right. They're always saying now there's estimated that 70 to 80% of humans are deficient in magnesium. Right. Mm-hmm. And part of that is because our food supply has changed, but magnesium is one of those minerals that's essential for over 300 biochemical pathways, but a lot of those are in the adrenals. And so if our magnesium is not being replenished on a regular basis, and that level of stress and that demand is depleting that magnesium just as fast as you're trying to refill it, you're not really going to get ahead. right? You're always going to look like there's a magnesium component or a magnesium deficiency. Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
The same thing with vitamin C. So when we talk about supporting the adrenals, even if people are in just maybe like a phase 1 dysfunction where they're starting to feel a little bit tired, right? They're not quite meeting those energy goals, if you will. They have trouble waking up in the morning, or they have trouble unwinding. During the day, I encourage people to try and get good forms of vitamin C in the morning, and maybe a little support with the sodium and potassium, with the electrolytes, because we know the adrenals also balance out electrolytes. And so that'll help to kind of take off the demand a little bit, because you're making sure that those ingredients are readily available when your cortisol should be at its highest of a morning. Yeah. And so adding good forms of vitamin C with electrolytes can be really beneficial as well.
Yeah. So I'm glad that you touched on that, because that's where I was going to head to, is like the adrenals produce cortisol, demand a lot. If there's a high demand for that, like basically the way I understand it, lay claim to our vitamin C, right? And our magnesium. However, there are other chemicals in our body that need vitamin C to be produced in adequate amounts. But if the adrenals are in high demand and they've laid claim to most of the vitamin C, these guys don't have enough available to create what they need to create. So then you see, and that's why we test all of these 3 things, because then you see this whole chain of events, right? Like adrenal fatigue, or like high demand for vitamin C for all this cortisol. Well, then that impacts our neurotransmitters and our ability to create dopamine and norepinephrine and epinephrine, right? And those are impacted and cannot produce at an adequate rate, because all the demand for the cofactors or the enzymes is going to the demand for the cortisol, because that's the body always prioritizes survival first.
Yes.
Right? Feeling good and being happy, if we're being chased by a lion, does not matter.
Yeah.
We have to survive the lion first to be able, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, to be able to move up into the things that are not survival dependent.
Exactly. Yeah. That's why, making sure that those nutrients are available. Yeah. But understanding, it's like, okay, your body is trying to conserve all the energy it can, right? If it thinks it's in survival mode, because and especially if this is a chronic survival mode, a chronic stress, right? It's like, okay, we don't know how long, right, things are going to last. And so it's like, okay, how I'm going to allocate my energy, I'm going to allocate my nutrients in the best way possible, right, to make sure that we survive. And so that's why, checking in and making sure that those ingredients are available is going to help to address the demand for cortisol, but also help to decrease the negative effects in other organ systems because of the lack of nutrients available for those processes to occur.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a balance. It's a balance, but understanding sort of how our perception of stress and the timing of that perception and our ability to address stress is so important into understanding what the long-term effects are, right? That when people start to experience that lack of energy, the difficulty concentrating, right? What looks like the hormone changes, the acne, the hair loss, the insomnia, or trouble falling asleep. Tell folks, those are all like check engine lights that your body's like, hey, I need some extra support here. I need some help. And so when you put all those together and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, when we're looking at the root cause, this is more of an adrenal picture than it is like, say, a hormone picture or another organ system picture. Then at any point you can start to reverse things. But if you just ignore those signs and you just keep on the same path, you're setting yourself up for that dysfunction, because your body, you can't really keep up with the demand.
Right.
We can feel very invincible, especially when we're younger. Our body can take a lot of abuse, right? Our body is very resilient, but it's not indestructible. Right? Our body needs that support to be able to have those appropriate cycles of cortisol or other biochemical reactions in order to be healthy.
Yeah. Cool. Anything else?
I think that'll do it.
All right. So I will include in the show notes, I will put the episode about stress resilience and the episode about magnesium and talking about all the different forms of magnesium in there for people that are interested. And I will also include our website with the New Beginnings program if you guys are interested in addressing your health from a holistic perspective, right? As we've already told, part of our program is that you will take a panel that will measure your neurotransmitters, your hormones, and your adrenals. And then we do 12 weeks of one-on-one coaching to start basically diving into the mindset and becoming resilient to stress, but also create more self-confidence, right? So you can start going after the things you want to in life and creating things in your life that you have wanted in your life that you haven't been able to. So it's a very unique program. It's the only one out there that I'm aware of. So check it out if you guys are interested, and we'll catch you next episode.